One of the most obvious facts about living things is that they are found in an almost unbelievable number of varieties. From fast-moving one-celled animals, only visible under a microscope, to gigantic elephants. There are brightly colored animals that look like plants, animals in the shape of stars, balls, then flat animals, long skinny animals, animals that fly, that swim, that crawl. And there are also plants that come in every size, shape, and color. There are trees that can live to be thousands of years old. And there are strange mushrooms and fungi that disappear in a few days. The fact is, biologists have recorded well over 1 million kinds of living things, and many millions more remain unrecorded. Let us see how, by learning to recognize certain patterns, biologists are able to classify living things into special groups, and, as a result, are better able to understand the relationships that exist among the fantastic variety of life forms that inhabit this planet. The classification system in use today places each living thing into a series of specific groups based on similarities and differences in body structure, color, behavior, and so on. The first and largest group into which any living thing can be classified is its kingdom. This is followed by its phylum or division, then its class, order, family, genus, and finally its species. Methods of classification are constantly changing. About 30 years ago, only 2 kingdoms, plant and animal, were used in classification. But today, most biologists use a new classification system based on 5 kingdoms. Now, a living thing can be classified either as a moneron, a protist, a fungus, a plant, or an animal. With well over 1 million types of living things inhabiting the world, classifying them all into logical categories is a big job. To better understand how all the basic types of living things are classified, let us begin by taking a look at the 5 kingdoms of life. Every living thing is made up of at least one cell. Although most cells are so small they can only be seen under a microscope, they are still the basic building blocks of life. A drop of water from a pond can contain millions of living things of many different types, and many are made up of only one cell. These one-celled organisms are the simplest living things and belong to either one of 2 kingdoms. The one-celled members of the kingdom Monera contains the smallest and most ancient forms of life. Some of today's Monerans look almost exactly like the fossils of the earliest forms of life that first appeared on Earth over 3 billion years ago. Monerans are unique because their single cells lack separate nuclei within their cytoplasm. Monerans can be animal-like, such as these bacteria that must absorb food in order to survive. Some of these Moneran bacteria cause serious diseases in other living things. But some are helpful and live in the intestines of human beings where they produce needed vitamins. Monerans can also be plant-like, such as these blue-green algae that can make their own food from water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight by photosynthesis. Many scientists think of blue-green algae as the simplest type of plant. Members of this kingdom, the protists, are very tiny living things that were once called the protozoa. These creatures are much larger than bacteria and have only one cell. But unlike Monerans, their cells have a separate nucleus, and the cytoplasm of their cells is much more complicated than Moneran cells. Just as with the Monerans, There are animal-like protists, such as this Euploides, that can actively seek out food, or this Paramecium that moves by wiggling little hairs on the outside of its one-celled body. Euploides and Paramecia are like animals because they cannot make their own food. One-celled algae are the protists that are like plants. They can make their own food by photosynthesis. These algae are very important because they provide food for many other life forms, and they also make huge amounts of oxygen. For the oceans and other bodies of water are filled with these tiny creatures. Some of these simple plants move about just as swiftly as animal-like protists, and many clump together to create colonies of cells, a feat which probably led to the creation of the many-celled creatures found in all of the 3 other kingdoms of living things. The members of this kingdom that we are most familiar with are the fungi that grow on the sides of old dead trees, and mushrooms. Unlike protists and monerians, fungi are formed from many different cells. Fungi cannot make food by photosynthesis, so they must spend their whole lives embedded in their food supplies. Even mushrooms are embedded in the earth and have a huge underground network of threads by which they take in nutrients. Scientists have recently discovered a single fungus whose thread network covers nearly 30 acres and weighs over 100 tons, making it one of the world's largest living things. Fungi also make up an important part of the driest living things on Earth, the lichens. The lichens we see here are algae living together with fungi in a way that is helpful to each. The algae part of the lichen creates food for the fungi part, and the fungi part of the lichen helps keep the algae part alive by preventing it from drying out. Of all living things, plants are probably the most important to humans. Like fungi, plants are complicated organisms made from many cells. Plants, just like certain monerians and protists, can trap the energy of the sunlight and convert it into food, and into oxygen for us to breathe by photosynthesis. The fact that true plants do not have to search for food causes them to spend their entire lives pretty much in one spot. But plants do move their bodies so they can capture the most sunlight. This movement just happens so slowly we can't see it. Like plants and fungi, true animals are complicated creatures made from many cells. Animals like fungi and certain monerians and protists cannot carry out photosynthesis. Instead, they must take in food to survive. Because they must find food, they are much more active than plants. And the variety of body types and feeding styles found in the animal kingdom is truly unbelievable. Beyond the kingdom level of classification, living things are also classified into many smaller subgroups. To help understand the basics of this subgroup classification, let us look closely at one creature, the fox squirrel, and learn step by step how it is classified. First and most obviously, it is a member of the animal kingdom just like monkeys, worms, bees, jellyfish, and slugs. The following step in classification is to place the squirrel into a second large division or phylum. Squirrels, just like birds, frogs, fish, and many other animals, have a backbone. That is, they are vertebrates. This phylum of vertebrate animals is given the name Chordata. Of all vertebrate animals, only one class, the mammals, have bodies covered with hair and nurse their young with milk. Squirrels, gorillas, and javelinas are all mammals. But out of all the mammals, only those belonging to the order of rodents have very long, sharp front teeth. Squirrels, prairie dogs, and mice are all rodents. Out of the entire group of rodents, only a few, like the squirrels and chipmunks, have bushy tails. Because of this, they are placed in a separate family called the shade-tails, because when they curl up their tails, their bodies can be shaded. However, only some of these bushy-tailed rodents climb trees. They are classified as members of the squirrel genus. And finally, of all the many kinds of squirrels, only the fox squirrel has reddish-brown fur on its back and yellowish-brown fur on its belly. When biologists talk about this variety of squirrel, they use both its genus and species name, Sciurus niger, which is just like using a person's last and first names. Translated from Greek and Latin into English, the fox squirrel's name means dark-colored shade tail. Biologists will use an organism's scientific name no matter which language they are speaking. This kind of naming helps get rid of a lot of confusion that happens when common names for living things are used. And by using classification principles, our understanding of how different kinds of organisms are related to one another is greatly improved. All living things can be classified into one of the 5 kingdoms we have just seen. And almost all living things can be classified further into a definite phylum or division, class, order, family, and can be given scientific genus and species names. By classifying living things into separate groups, scientists have been able to discover a natural pattern of how they are organized, going from simple to complicated. This natural order reflects how life developed on Earth. First, the waters of our planet, filled with simple single-celled creatures without a nucleus, like today's Monarans. Later, in the history of life on Earth, came the one-celled creatures, like the protists, that had a nucleus and were capable of more complicated activities than the Monarans. Then came the many-celled creatures, the animals, plants, and fungi, and each followed its own special path of change, becoming increasingly more complicated over time. As some began to inhabit the Earth's surface, filling it with sometimes strange, but often beautiful living things. Classification continues to play an important role in understanding the richness and beauty of the life that surrounds us, and has helped us, as human beings, to appreciate our place in the great natural order of living things.